This is where I live. It is one of the few places in the Netherlands that isn't entirely flat. During the last ice age, the glaciers that formed in northern Europe came down to cover about half the country. And, as this educational video taught us, pushed the landscape upwards around its edges. They aren't exactly mountains, but still they have some stories to tell. Stories about individuals, about families, stories about a country.
I do believe that we humans define ourselves by the stories we tell, and especially the stories we tell about ourselves. But what is true of humans is also true of nations. And I think we define ourselves as a nation by the stories we tell about ourselves and what we remember about ourselves.
I've always had a fascination with international cinema as a sort of gateway to another country, to get a glimpse of another culture, another history, another set of norms and values. The challenge, however, as I always found, was deciding where to begin. Because how do you know, especially as a foreigner, which films, which stories truly define another country? Well, one way that I thought was really interesting was recently brought to my attention by the new Movie podcast, which spotlights films that were massive cultural phenomena in their home countries, but nowhere else. And coincidentally, the country that is featured in their first episode just so happens to be my own, which inspired me to examine the stories that shaped the culture that I was born and raised in, and reflect on what it really means to understand a country through cinema. So today, let's take a trip to my home country. Let's explore the stories of the Netherlands. Compared to Hollywood, our film industry is extremely small, and not always taken all that seriously by Dutch people. There is a common joke here that Dutch films contain either Nazis or nudity, or both. I don't have the exact numbers, but it indeed seems that many of our larger productions are set in the Second World War. However, unlike the related stories from English-speaking countries, take for example Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, The Longest Day, Battle of the Bulge, or A Bridge Too Far, all of which cover a part of the militaristic efforts that eventually led to our liberation and that of Europe as a whole. Our stories are a little different.
Mijn volk, nadat ons land met angstvallige nauwgezetheid al deze maanden een stipte neutraliteit had in acht genomen, is in de afgelopen nacht door de Duitse Wehrmacht zonder de minste waarschuwing een plotselinge aanval op ons gebied gedaan.
On the 10th of May in the year 1940, despite my nation's efforts to remain neutral, German forces attacked the Netherlands. At the center of one of the most important lines of defense was a hill called the Grebbeberg. It is here that Dutch soldiers took a stand and suffered a decisive loss against their invader. Being just outside of my house, I walked these grounds almost daily. It is strange to contemplate that in these, what to me are peaceful forests and fields, hundreds of my countrymen laid down their lives. Popular reports say that we stood bravely against the superior might of our enemy, but as historians with a more critical eye have pointed out, the German divisions that were sent here, while having greater numbers, were not necessarily better equipped or in possession of greater technologies, as is so often assumed. No, the far more likely reality is that compared to the Germans, our soldiers were poorly trained, poorly supplied, and poorly organized. On top of that, they were faced with heavy artillery, resulting in a severe loss of morale, and not long after, the loss of the battle. The fall of the Grebbeberg caused the entire line of defense to break, which, together with the bombardment of Rotterdam, eventually led to our surrender on May 14th, just a few days after the invasion started. The thing is, I had no real knowledge of what exactly took place here until I moved here about a year ago and encountered the remnants and local monuments. This one containing an inscription that roughly translates to 5 days and freedom was lost, 5 years until it was reborn. So difficult it is for justice to prevail. Let these grounds remind you of that. The story of our quick surrender is general knowledge, but mostly in broad strokes. There are no popular films or other well-known dramatized stories detailing the specifics. When I first learned about the Second World War, I must have been somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. The story I was told was not about grand military operations or about brave soldiers storming the beaches. It was about Anne Frank hiding in the attic. It was about ordinary citizens living in fear under a foreign invader. Both those who were specifically targeted by the Nazis, like the Jews and other minority groups, as well as those who tried to protect them or made an effort to resist the Nazi oppression in other ways. And this is what most of the Dutch World War II films are, in some way or another, about. Not military victory, but resistance. The two that are most well known and most loved by Dutch audiences are probably Soldier of Orange and Black Book, both directed by Paul Verhoeven, who you probably know for his international works like RoboCop, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers. Soldier of Orange was released in 1977 and follows a group of Dutch students during the occupation. The film is generally praised for offering a nuanced portrayal of ordinary life during these years, and for depicting the strange day-to-day contrast between destructive violence and business as usual. Initially, the lead characters are shown as apathetic to the brooding conflict, believing that it does not concern them because of our country's neutrality.
We blijven toch weer neutraal. Altijd geweest. Doe niet zo verrekte stom, zak.
It is only when the war comes to them that they realize the severity of the situation and join the resistance. The 2006 film Black Book is told through the perspective of a Jewish woman who infiltrates a Nazi headquarters. Like Soldier of Orange, it also portrays a variety of resistance efforts. But unlike the more privileged young men of that film, Black Book also really emphasizes the fear of having to live under a mask, of having to keep up an appearance, and the risks that were involved with navigating not just the dangers presented by the occupying force, but also those presented by fellow countrymen who sided with the enemy and operated as wolves in sheep's clothing. One notable aspect in many of these resistance stories, both historically as well as cinematically, is the focus on non-violence. Of all the countries occupied by Nazi Germany, the Netherlands stood out for having a relatively non-violent resistance. There were strikes, heists, acts of sabotage and counterintelligence, but most notably, there was a well-organized effort to offer refuge to those who needed it. Over the course of the war, around 350,000 people were successfully hidden from Nazi prosecution. This, I think, is in part because we were well aware that more violence wasn't going to do us any good. Aside from having already suffered an unambiguous military defeat in the initial invasion, the acts of violence that did occur during the resistance were often answered with severe retaliation. Perhaps the most infamous of these was the raid on Putten. After the murder of a German officer by resistance members, the entire town of Putten, where the attackers came from, was surrounded by German troops who burned down over 100 houses and took over 600 men, almost the entire male population of the town, who was subsequently placed into concentration camps. Only 48 returned. In 1948, a monument called the Grieving Widow was unveiled to commemorate the victims. It stands in a garden where empty squares reflect the lives that were lost, which is also the place of a yearly memorial. Though attended by hundreds of people, no one speaks. They only play music and sing the same songs that the victims sung when they were taken away. Though this particular event has not been turned into cinema, the underlying spirit of violence being answered with disproportionately more violence is quite common in films about the Dutch resistance, which seems to be aware of how non-violent acts of defiance did more good than those that have only led to more suffering.
Nee, die godschof die moest dood. Bovendien, wat maakt het uit? Dat Tim nu toch tegen de muur gaat, lul! En nog 40 anderen. Dat jij zo nodig verzetsheldje moest spelen.
It is probably clear from all this that we are not really a militaristic nation, which I guess also explains why, for many years now, no matter how high the production values of their advertisements are, our military has been having great trouble with recruiting new personnel. Some films too have tried to invoke a kind of patriotism that is more like that of the Americans, like for example the film The Admiral, one of the biggest Dutch productions, which at times imitates an almost Michael Bay style of filmmaking to tell the tale of Michiel de Ruiter, one of our most well-known historic figures, in an obviously romanticized fashion. It may have worked for some who, unlike me, were raised with more nationalistic sensibilities. It definitely didn't work for the small group who protested the film for glorifying a story while making no mention of the colonial context it is set within. For most people, however, who have no strong connection to this period of history in either direction, I think it was just a little silly.
De Engelsen willen oorlog met ons voeren omdat wij Nederlanders zijn. Vrije Nederlanders.
But even here it is interesting that they chose this exact story, as it is set within 1672, also known as the Disaster Year, which was a period, not unlike the Second World War, in which the then Dutch Republic was under attack and on the brink of collapsing. Though I've told myself to be careful in making superficial generalizations, I do feel this spirit of resistance, this yearning for freedom, defines many of our popular stories. And when I say that, I have not even addressed what many Dutch people consider to be an essential part of our identity, that being our age-old battle against the water, which reached a crescendo in 1953 with the North Sea flood, a monumental flooding that resulted in almost 2,000 Dutch people losing their lives, and around 100,000 losing their homes and possessions. In 2009, a major Dutch production called The Storm recounted this historic event that reawakened our awareness about our vulnerability to the water, and that gave birth to an ambitious new line of defense. The resulting structures, known as the Delta Works, now stand as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The spirit of resistance can also be found in our most popular film, Turkish Delight, which is also directed by Paul Verhoeven and stars a young Rutger Hauer, who, like Verhoeven, went on to achieve international acclaim, most notably with his role in Blade Runner. Turkish Delight was a rather provocative film, one that had the timeless structure of a tragic love story, but also one that was very much rooted in the specifics of the Dutch counterculture of the 70s, as the bohemian main character was strongly associated with the so-called provos, or provocateurs, a non-violent cultural movement consisting of people who grew up during the long years of Reconstruction after World War II, and who now desired a society with less rigid norms, more freedom, and more fun. To this day, Turkish Delight holds our box office record for domestic films, was named the best Dutch film of the 20th century by the Netherlands Film Festival, and is still watched by many high school students who then pretend they've read the book it was based on for their literature class. In short, its cultural relevance is undeniable. For more about the historical significance of the film, I highly recommend checking out the Movie podcast on Dutch cinema, which focuses on Turkish Delight.
It's an insane whiplash of joy, death, sex, lots of sex.
Besides talking about the filmmaking process, they also dive deep into the counterculture movement associated with the film, and interview, among others, director Paul Verhoeven, cinematographer Jan de Bont, who also went on to direct Hollywood blockbusters like Speed and Tomb Raider, and main actress Monique van der Ven as part of their discussion. It is interesting to consider why, of all the films mentioned before, Turkish Delight went on to become so successful. For despite having plenty of bigger budget films about significant events, especially in recent years, trying to etch their way into our collective consciousness, many of them, like the earlier mentioned The Storm and The Admiral, but also others like The Resistance Banker, which tells the true story of the banker who, during the Second World War, found clever ways to move money around to fund the resistance. Redbad, which is about the Frisian king Redbad who fought for freedom against the Franks, and Nova Zembla, about a group of Dutch explorers who battled the elements trying to find the northeast passage to the Indies, were all received with lukewarm to poor responses. Redbad even became one of the biggest box office flops in our cinematic history. Why is that? The answer, I believe, lies in the perceived lack of authenticity of these films, which is an issue that, in part, has to do with the particularities of our film industry, and the implications of, among other things, having only one real film academy that, as some have argued, focuses too much on efficiency and technical competence, instead of philosophies and meanings, and having only one government fund for filmmakers, including a singular set of rules and guidelines that many of them have experienced as creatively limiting.
You needed that money, and the people that basically distributed the money felt that the movies that I made were so, let's say, public friendly that it could not be serious.
In comparison, Turkish Delight, whether you like or dislike it, was undeniably made with a strong sense of creative freedom, and had such an uninhibited sense of self-expression that even if the story wasn't directly relatable, it still felt like it captured something real and truthful, something timeless that still seems to resonate with many people today. But here we also have to address the issue of individual subjectivity and how it relates to our tendency to understand a country as a somewhat unified collective. For while I do think I have touched on some characteristics about the Netherlands here that many Dutch people will relate to, albeit in their own expression. On our last Remembrance Day, for example, André van Duin, a well-known national celebrity, gave a speech about the importance of freedom in general terms, but also spoke about what this meant to him personally, how every year he attends not the main commemoration, but visits another, smaller memorial a couple blocks over that remembers the LGBT victims who were prosecuted because of their sexuality. A memorial that for him points to the values that make our country stand out.
Het feit dat wij in Nederland sinds 1987 als eerste in de wereld zo'n monument hebben, tekent onze vrijheid. De vrijheid dat iedereen hier zichzelf mag zijn, zonder dat iemand anders daar wat van zegt.
But even so, in the end, all this remains the account of just one Dutch person. The account of someone who was always surrounded by these kinds of stories, who grew up in the area where Allied soldiers once dropped as part of Operation Market Garden, who went to the university in a city that was heavily bombarded and fought over for a bridge that was vital for the road to Germany. Someone who has always lived in places that still carry the scars from the destruction of warfare, who has always walked in forests that still harbor abandoned bunkers, and who recognizes many of the scenes in our war stories. As such, it is undoubtedly a biased account of what it means to be Dutch, and about what stories define my country. In fact, especially in the last few years, there has been a growing debate in the Netherlands, both politically as well as culturally, about our national identity, about what it is, what it should be, and by extension, which stories are worth telling, which stories must be passed on. This is no insignificant matter, for while it is understandable that we desire stories that build towards unity, that give us something that can be shared and valued by all, stories in which we feel we mattered as a people, as a country. Such stories will fall flat when perceived as inauthentic. At worst, such stories can also be deceiving. They may raise one voice while suppressing someone else's, celebrate one story while hiding another. And the discussion as to whose story is more valid, more important, can become quite heated. This seems to be an issue in many countries today. Countries that are increasingly characterized by polarization, individualization, by uncertainty and disconnection. One can, however, wonder to what extent this is a sign of the times, and not an issue that, in some way or another, is always present. Maybe that's what a country really is. A group of people in a perpetual state of identity crisis. In a continuous search for stories that create some kind of unity within diversity, some kind of balance between competing perspectives. Stories that reflect the multitude of voices, experiences, and worldviews. And so, to truly understand a foreign country, I think it is always important to seek out as many as you can. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Netherlands, I could not provide you with all, but I hope I have given you a start by offering mine. This video was made in collaboration with Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Every day Mubi premieres a new film, from brand new work by emerging filmmakers to modern masterpieces from today's greatest icons. There is always something new to discover. You can try Mubi for free for 30 days at mubi.com/likestoriesofold. I also encourage you to check out the Mubi podcast to listen to their episode on Paul Verhoeven's Turkish Delight, and dive even deeper into the cinema and culture of my home country. Future episodes will cover film stories from all over the world, including the longest-running film in the history of Indian cinema, a Mexican melodrama that became the biggest movie in the Soviet Union, and the micro-budget feature shot on video that sparked the modern Nigerian film industry. Featuring interviews with filmmakers, critics, academics, and historians. The Mubi podcast is a great way to discover unique film stories and explore all sides of cinema culture. You can subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. And again, for a whole month of great cinema for free, be sure to visit mubi.com/likestoriesofold.